Does everyone have the agenda? Does anyone need me to drop it in the chat again or anything? Not seeing anyone. I think the first thing we had named for the agenda was talking about the transforming community safety updates that had been made to the City Council's Public Health and Safety Committee. I know that you all had been watching both the process around the transforming community safety, community engagement, and also we talked a bit about the 911 Alternatives to Police Response Work Group had presented to the TEC last fall. So at least some of the folks here, I believe, were here for that. And then we've talked a little bit about in the city budget for 2021, some of their recommendations got passed around like moving mental health related calls to a mental health crisis team instead. And so linked in the agenda are the updates that were made to City Council about both that Alternatives to Police Response work and the general community engagement. And I'm happy to try to talk through it a little bit if that would be helpful, but curious if anyone had any initial reflections on that or things they would want the TEC bringing up to those respective presenters.
Hey, track before, not to sideline, but do we have to like adopt the agenda and minutes and all of that stuff, or is that?
You're not sidelining. Subcommittees are a very weird thing where we technically can't adopt agendas and minutes because there's never quorum, but we still have to record the meeting. So
just
that's why that's why I skipped over that, and you are always welcome to check if I'm missing a part of the agenda. Thank you.
No problem.
I guess I'll start with, did anyone get a chance to review either of the presentations and have any thoughts?
My initial thoughts are it's a start, but I recognize that we have to start somewhere, but it does not seem like, I mean, in my ideal world, there is a lot more. So yeah, I guess that's just my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I would agree. My initial thoughts are it's hard to contextualize what something like this would look like based on the small amount of the MPD budget that was reallocated towards this kind of work. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say.
Yeah, I hear and resonate with both of those, and thank you for saying that. I feel like I have a question around if there is specific feedback you would want brought back to either the community engagement team or the folks who are kind of leading and evaluating the pilots around alternatives to policing. I know one thing that is named in the recommendations that Casey and I have been working on is ensuring that there is trans competency training for the new mental health crisis response teams. And I'm curious beyond that. Like, I think there are longer term questions of like, maybe the TEC wants to push council to like reallocate more money in the 2022 budget. And so like both bookmarking that, and I'm curious if there's any more immediate questions that are things we want to either incorporate into the recommendations to council, or is feedback that I should be passing directly to the staff who are supporting some of this work.
My concern is coming from, I used to work at a youth shelter, and I've utilized the mobile crisis team many times. The the length of time from when you call and ask for assistance to, you know, by the time that they actually get there, it can be, I mean, it's usually an hour. And by that time, the crisis has died down, you know, people are de-escalating. And so my question would be, how are we going to ensure like proper response times for mental health crises and what that looks like, especially since there is only a small portion of the budget being reallocated. Yes, so that would be my question.
I have questions around the hiring practices of the mental health team. Just how do they decide who gets to be on the mental health team? You know, what's the credentials? You know, what's the experience? What's the relationship with community? All of those different markers that are necessary, especially when we start talking about people that hold intersectional identities. Who's showing up for us matters, especially around that, like just trans competency, BIPOC competency training, etc. And then I'm also wondering, like, who's deciding what that training looks like for the people that are hired? You know, do we get to see the community get to see what that training looks like and provide feedback and they have to make adjustments to the training so that we're ensured that the mental health mobile teams are actually doing the things that we find meaningful to sort of de-escalating crisis.
Yeah, I would echo all of that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would just echo all of that, and you know, just also thinking about like, does it have a trauma-informed lens? Like just adding that to the pot. But yeah, everything that was just said, agreeing wholeheartedly.
And I just wanted to piggyback off what Kenzie was saying. So I know that that there's a lot of data that is collected in terms of like call times and things like that. And with certain like groups, they can post that data, make that public. But do we have access to like response times, certain things like that, how many interactions, you know, we're having with the public, how many crises per week, per month, et cetera, et cetera. If that is public knowledge, if we can have access to that. And then HR has to have something about hiring practices and who they're hiring. And if we could look at that too, maybe edit it or chime in, et cetera.
Another thing I'll say in reviewing the presentation is I like the idea of a community de-escalation training. So I'll just kind of like co-sign that or highlight that. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and maybe if there's a way that we can have community members come in during some of these trainings. I know that training is expensive, but if there's a way to facilitate that, that might be productive as well, maybe save a little bit of money.
Clarification question, Billy, to make sure what I'm capturing what you're saying correctly. Are you saying you would want community members to like provide testimony and training during some of these trainings, or like you would want them to also be able to participate, and that would be a way that community de-escalation training would happen?
I think participation would be ideal. I know that during COVID, there's a lot of like virtual things happening, but I think it's always more beneficial to, that's just my personal opinion, have trained community members in. But if that's not possible, I know that there's certain legal barriers to that, but.
No, that makes sense. I just wanted to make sure I understood. what you were saying. Thank you all so much for all of those. My impulse is I'm going to reach out to the staff in the Office of Violence Prevention, Office of Performance and Innovation, who are leading these pilots, to pass on all of these questions, and can also connect with folks in HR as I get a sense of what the hiring process looks like. And I can report back to you all with what I get from them, either like directly the content of what it's going to be so that you can make edits on it if we're able to get that, and or in terms of the question about like how to get access to the data on various things, I will let you know what's possible, and what the like data policies are right now, and then push to theoretically actually get that data and get it to you as well. Are there other things other than what's just been named that you want me to bring forward as recommendations, either for the Alternatives to Policing pilot or the community engagement process?
I mean, it seems like they're aware of the fact that their survey excluded a lot of marginalized groups. So I would caution that they take that into consideration somehow, that they're not, like the survey data isn't based in any kind of like real world. It's not based in the real world because it left out a bunch of people, the people that are going to be most impacted by this in general. So
agreed. And I think in that presentation, they did not say whether they've at any point like filtered or sorted the data to see like just what were the perspectives of just Black residents or BIPOC residents more broadly or anything like that. But I can also follow up to see if they've even done that, and what that looks like, if that feels helpful. Because I feel like I have a question both about like, what are you doing with survey data if it's not representative, and like, are we paying the most attention to the survey data that represents those most impacted by this question? And I will also say, I meant to say this earlier, in addition to following up with the Office of Performance and Innovation, I think some of these pieces you're naming can also go in to the presentation of recommendations to council, particularly because the intersection of me asking staff certain questions and council asking them certain questions is more likely to produce results than just me asking them. And so I'm happy to add that to that document as well. If no one has anything else on that, I'm thinking maybe we can move on to talking about the recommendations to City Council. And one of the most immediate questions I have for you, as Casey and I were talking this through, we acknowledge that it's a very long document, and also that there's nothing in the document that we wanted to just throw out for the sake of length, but it felt important to present it in order of priority, knowing that all of this is important, but knowing that this presentation is going to come at the end of a very long council meeting. And if there are particular things that it is a consensus amongst the TEC, like are the things we most want council to pick up, it makes sense to put those first, both in one-on-one conversations with council members and in the presentation to the whole council. And so I'm curious to hear from you all if there are either like broader topic areas or specific recommendations on here that feel like highest priorities to you. And that's also a question we'll ask of the full TEC. But I think right now in drafting these recommendations, this subcommittee is a really useful place to kind of like get into the meat of it more than we have time to in the full TEC. So bringing all of those questions here first.
I definitely don't want to try and reverse engineer this, but maybe thinking about what council has the greatest power to actually change might be a good way to think about that, or think about that in a different way. Not that, you know, we shouldn't shoot for the moon, but still thinking about like what's in their power that they could do easily, presenting that first, potentially. I don't know, just a thought.
I was thinking similarly. I think there's a lot of focus on housing right now, and I also really like all of the housing pieces that we've brought up in the recommendations. And I think that that is within the realm of possibility, because there's active change happening surrounding housing right now. So I really like, you know, eviction prevention. And sorry, I'm just looking over this again. There are quite a few housing pieces. Yeah, finishing housing code component of maximum occupancy ordinance to ensure that the number of people allowed to live in a unit is not dependent on definitions of biological family. Yeah, so I really like those housing pieces.
Thank you for that. And I am, as we write this up into recommendations, I am cleaning it up and putting all the housing things in the same place, because I know in the bullet point version I attached, it was still organized by where I'd gotten the suggestions from, rather than theme. So thank you for moving through that to find them. And yeah, I will put the housing pieces together. And particularly the housing pieces that I know are on the council progressive block, like agenda of priorities for 2021. While that requires getting enough votes from the rest of council to pass it, I agree are things that in some ways we like know very concretely are possible for council to do because they're ordinances that at least some council members are working on.
And I know that that's like a very high priority for the mayor, and he is seeking re-election. So like, not to be prude, but like if it's something that he thinks would benefit that, I'm sure that that's something that the council would look to if it's within their power to pass that policy or legislation. So might be a good recommendation to start out of the gate.
That totally makes sense. I'm pulling up the document right now as well to see if there are other more specific questions that I wanted to run by you all. I think I'm pulling up the other version of this document. I think, so what Casey and I were attempting to do was flesh out all of them to the level where they would be things that council can concretely do. The feedback we've gotten from Councilmember Cunningham is the more like specific and step-by-step a board's recommendations are, the easier it is for council members to take them and run with them. And prior to presenting to council, I'm also going to make sure these recommendations get sent to Councilmember Cunningham and Council Vice President Jenkins. And our co-chairs are also meeting with Councilmember Ellison, since he's the chair of the subcommittee of the committee that you all are technically presenting to. The COVID reorganization of council committees is weird. And so hopefully some of them will pick up on some of that as well. But as I tried to categorize these more broadly to kind of structure them, knowing that we would still check in with you all about order, the four like big buckets that these more or less fit in, this is a little messy to categorize, but I called it like housing, safety and healing, training, and restrooms. And I'm curious, I think I'm hearing a lot of energy around housing going first, both in terms of like what council can do and is doing, and in terms of how high of a priority it feels. And I'm curious if you have like an order in which you'd want the rest of it showing up. The safety and healing is the biggest like block of a bunch of different things, and includes a broad range of like funding for mental health resources, maybe some legislation around violence against trans folks, but figuring out with the city attorney's office what's actually possible there, and the potential public awareness campaign, all of which like fits somewhere or another into that conversation. So having just babbled, I will summarize the question, which is, after housing, the kind of categories that exist are safety and healing, training, and restrooms. And I'm curious if anyone else has a clear, like, this is the like next thing we should be talking to council about.
I think, in my opinion, that's a pretty solid list in order. I think safety also very much ties in with housing, so would be really good to just intersect into the following. I think also during COVID, priority wise, that sounds pretty spot on to me. And then for training, can you expand on what exactly you have under training, I guess, or like be more specific?
Totally, thank you. Training right now is a mix of two things. Part of it is the conversation about the gender inclusivity training for city staff, growing that, advertising that, adding more training, getting HR to distribute their survey about trans equity in our workplace so that we can then figure out better what we need to train on. And then the other part of that is the training and inclusion requirements in city contracts and grants. And so that partially that overlaps with the piece about like what requirements are we making of shelters, which is also mentioned in the housing piece. But then also talking about potential requirements for our contracts with interpreters and translators, which is something Hunta's helped us highlight, and about other social service providers outside of housing, particularly employment being something else we've talked about. I think that's all that's existing under training right now. Casey, I know you were possibly going to write up some of that. Are there things that you're noticing that I'm missing?
No, I think for the most part you got it all.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification, and I think that that's a proper organization of like things to discuss. I think, like you said, a lot of them intersect with one another, and maybe organizing them in a fashion that makes it easy to just go from like point to point to point. I think that's pretty spot on.
I agree. But there's one bullet point on our recommendations right now regarding the formal apology to CC McDonald that I think is very important, but it also doesn't really flow with our other recommendations. And so I'm wondering, do we also talk about, like, under our safety and healing recommendations, it might make sense to further talk about the current justice system and its relationship to trans people. I think just saying, oh, and also apologize to CC McDonald, that doesn't have a lot of context. But of course, if you're talking about how like trans women are being put in men's prisons, I mean, that's a huge problem. And that's something that is a larger bullet point that also feeds into, and this is why, you know, Minneapolis should have a hand in, you know, enacting this like restoration. So those are my initial thoughts.
Totally. Thank you for that. And I should mention, I'm realizing this isn't in the document. That was a recommendation that came out of a listening session. And my plan is to check in with Cece and make sure that that is something she would want on there before putting it forward. And so I've left it on the draft doc right now. But until I'm able to have that conversation with her, I don't know if it may end up being like a conversation that the TEC brings to council as part of like the 2021 recommendations later in the year. Even I agree that it makes sense to provide more context if we do incorporate it, but I'm not sure if we will, because I'm not sure if I'll be able to have the conversations that make sense with her and other folks before including it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, you know, what she would want to see out of the recommendations if you are able to have that conversation. So that's all.
I am curious if there are other things on here that folks have questions about, want to see more detail on. The comments on this document, transparently, as I look at them, are a little bit of a disaster because they were kind of notes to self as Casey and I were talking. But I think particularly if there's any of the comments going on in the corners that you have questions on, responses to, reflections about, that's super helpful for me to hear as the two of us kind of try to turn the bullet point doc into like an actual written up speech. Or if there's things that you're like, track, what was this supposed to mean? Also great question, please ask. I think one other specific question I'll pose, if folks don't have more general reflections. One thing I haven't gotten to talk to CVP directly, but my supervisor, Joy, brought a question to her about, like, are there priorities you want to see the TEC focusing on this year? And one of the things that she said she wanted to see recommendations around, the two things she mentioned, one is addressing the trans panic defense, which I'm talking to the city attorney's office about whether and in what form we're legally allowed to do that based on state law restrictions. And the second thing she said was making recommendations around addressing violence against trans women. And so one of the things that Casey and I were talking about and also acknowledging was not our question to answer, that we were kind of fleshing out in the comments, is like, what are the specific places that the TEC is currently writing recommendations that relate to that ask from CVP, and what are the additional things we want to add? And so we were talking about things related to housing, related to like getting the Office of Violence Prevention to expand their priorities and focus of their work. Things related to employment, maybe the public awareness campaign, depending on what it looks like. And then Sunu Srestha, who's come to some TEC meetings, it is a city staffer writing a blueprint around preventing human trafficking, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And part of that blueprint is also going to involve recommendations around ending criminalization of sex work. And so echoing some of the recommendations in her blueprint. And those are the things we identified, but want to raise the question of, are there other things that should be included or should be better fleshed out in response to the kind of broader ask that CVP made?
So forgive me, I'm looking at this again. And I guess my question again is going to come back to training. Like, I don't know how, because these are just recommendations, specific we get in terms of like a budget or asks or things like that, because addressing violence against women, like, a lot of this is going to be, I feel like a lot of the asks obviously would be proactive so that we don't have to be reactive in the future, like preventing these issues before they arise. So in terms of like trainers and things like that, how involved is the TEC in choosing appropriate trainers or like asking for credentials, or do we have the position to assign these people? Like, who makes that decision, basically, is my question.
So in terms of trainers who are doing like 101 trainings for city staff, there will be a small panel. Like, I would love recommendations of potential trainers from TEC folks, and then there will be a small panel of folks who are selecting trainers, and it is open to anyone on the TEC if you want to be on that panel. So if you would want to help select, and therefore kind of also be in the conversation about curriculum with the trainer, let me know, and I would love to loop you into that. And if you feel like I don't have the capacity about this, but I do have like these 3 suggestions about what should be in any curriculum they deliver that you want me to pass on, also let me know and I will do that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, because I basically am seeing, or like a pattern where folks who should be better, sorry, my phone's acting up, folks who should be or have more awareness, you know, about these marginalized communities, or they're kind of just like missing the point, I guess, when they're presenting it to council, or council is presenting it to the public, where we could just cut that off by, you know, having people who have the right credentials to start this in the first place. I don't know. It just seems like it's creating more problems than need be. But that would be my only, I guess, suggestion there. But we gotta wait to hear back from them, sounds like. and get those recommendations. But yeah, sorry, I'm all over the place.
If no one has anything else immediate on the recommendations, that's also totally fine. And you are very welcome and very invited to email both Casey and I, or either of us, if there's particular things you'd want added. And I know as well that a lot of these recommendations are on really intense and triggering topics. And as a matter of fact, everything we've discussed today is, which I don't think I framed or held in any way beforehand, but want to at least acknowledge now. And am grateful to you all for finding the ways that work for you to be in this conversation. And I'm also always open to talking more about if there are ways of holding conversations around the really intense work that would work better for you. That is just a belated, I meant to say that at the beginning. The last thing I had put on the agenda was just space to talk about next steps and other policy priorities. We've been using the policy meetings for a couple months, mostly to track the community safety work going on in the city and to work on these policy recommendations. The policy recommendations will hopefully be presented in February. I need to actually pin down a date for that and coordinate that with Kenzie and Hunter. But I feel great about, I have to put agendas up 24 hours before these meetings, so I have always just been doing that to make sure there's something, but I feel great about directing this as makes sense. Like if it's a track, continue bringing back information about the community safety work and anything that's moving forward on any of the policy areas we recommended, that sounds great. If there's other areas you want to be looking into, and we'll flesh this out a little bit more at Wednesday's strategic planning too, I feel great about that. So I think in that ramble, my brain is tired today. The question I'm asking is once we present these recommendations, what would feel most useful for you moving forward out of this space, or what topics or conversations do you want to be prioritizing?
I would like to continue the conversation of decriminalizing sex work. That's just fresh in my brain right now. And my organization right now, the link is, we have a safe harbor division that works a lot with sexually exploited youth. And so I'm going to reach out to them and see what kind of things they're working on and what kind of things that they want to see for the future. Because it's just very important. So that's all.
Does anyone else have anything they want to focus on moving forward, or that would be useful for me to make sure I'm continuing to track and bring updates on? If not, is there anything else that anyone wanted to check in about before we wrap up? I want to just leave a little open space for any questions or other thoughts that aren't related to anything we've talked about yet.
No pressure, but curious when we can expect to see like the revised recommendations to council.
Remarkable question. So in an ideal world, I will have finished the part that I'm responsible for by the end of the week. And I'm going to, knowing that both the co-chairs are meeting with Councilmember Ellison next Wednesday, and also that I have a one-on-one with CVP on Monday, and it would be great to have as finished of a doc to reference as possible. That is my goal. And I can send them to you all as soon as I get them done. Casey, I don't know what you've been thinking for the pieces of them that you're trying to write.
I know I wrote a little bit this morning. I should be able to have my stuff done by Friday, so you can have it all together for your meeting.
Thank you so much. That would be wonderful. And I will send them to you all once we've gotten them fully written up. And again, still like, I will consider that a draft, as in like, if you have comments once it's all in written form, please pass them on so we can edit them, but it will at least be fully written and not just a ton of notes to self in a form that can be shown to council members while it's still draft. Does that feel good? Sweet. Any other questions or last things? If not, we will wrap up a little early. Is there anyone, once I send out minutes, who would be willing to just summarize the minutes at the next, not Wednesday's strategic planning, but the next traditional TEC meeting and do the policy report back?
I can do that.
Okay, sweet. Thanks, Kenzie. That's all I've got then. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope everyone gets some time in the sun, or at least in front of a sunny window at some point today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
Oh.